So we continue this evening with Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine. We're in the 8th chapter, The Methods of Vedantic Knowledge. And he has begun the chapter by looking at the nature of reality, Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, and how it extends itself into the world, and that part of our concept in this study with him is to look at the relationship that this reality has with the world and with the figure of the human self. And how do we come to a knowledge of that? Clearly, to understand it, we have to be able to exceed the realm of the senses, to grip it, to get a hold on it. And we do that not through ratiocination, not through the play of reason, but more through the powers of intuition and imagination. And we'll dwell on that a bit more. But along the way, we recognize that reason has certainly a utility in the building of human knowledge, that it does attempt to go beyond the immediacy of our experience and try to establish rational rules by which we can assay the world around us. But in relying upon the physical senses as a starting point, we could pin ourselves in and not grow enough. So we have to be able to look at the mind, which collects all the data gathered by the senses, and the mind which governs and arranges that sensory information, has the capacity in and of itself to extend beyond sensorial contact and know directly, because it is the master sense, the sixth sense, what the object contacted can give to us. But even if we establish that, that simply enlarges the field of what we may know through the senses, because the mind, being the king of the senses, is still one of the senses and is not a direct knowledge. It is an indirect. It has to reach out and contact something, gather information, and fashion a view about reality based upon that. For us to understand what is Brahman, what is Satchitananda, means that we have to have a different power of consciousness. And that is what we're going to look at now in the second half of this chapter. And we begin with the paragraph, but always mental experience and the concepts of the reason have been held by it to be, even at their highest, a reflection in mental identifications and not the supreme self-existent identity. We have to go beyond mind and the reason. The reason, active in our waking consciousness, is only a mediator between the subconscious all that we come from in our evolution upwards, and the superconscious all towards which we are impelled by that evolution. So, what we have left behind is now subconscious to us. What we are is a creature of reason, still evolving. We have evolved from the subconscious. We are evolving towards the superconscious, that which is beyond reason. The subconscious and the superconscious are two different formulations of the same all, because the whole contains everything, no? The master word of the subconscious is life. The master word of the superconscious is light. In the subconscious, knowledge or consciousness is involved in action, for action is the essence of life. In the superconscious, action re-enters into light and no longer contains involved knowledge, but is itself contained in a supreme consciousness. Intuitional knowledge is that which is common between them, and the foundation of intuitional knowledge is conscious or effective identity between that which knows and that which is known. It is that state of common self-existence in which the knower and the known are one through knowledge. So we see this array of evolving consciousness leading from the subconscient through the conscient into the superconscient. What links them all is this power of intuition, which dwells behind all facets of knowledge. And he'll have much more to say about intuition in just a moment. So, how this intuition functions in life is through active power. You don't have to think about something, you reach out and you touch it, you know what to do. It is below the line of your consciousness. You don't have to consider. The mind likes to measure, to decide, if I do A, then B will be the result. And so it goes after it, finding modalities by which it can achieve. But its energization is haphazard, its results sometimes faulty. A superconscient action is based in light. Light flowers into active poise and achieves and fulfills its goal by its inherent nature. It is its very characteristic to reach successfully the goal which it envisions. So, back to his paragraph here. But in the subconscient, the intuition manifests in the action, in effectivity, and the knowledge or conscious identity is either entirely or more or less concealed in the action. In the superconscient, on the contrary, light being the law and the principle, the intuition manifests itself in its true nature as knowledge emerging out of conscious identity, and effectivity of action is rather the accompaniment or necessary consequent, and no longer masks as the primary fact. So this is what we were just saying. Between these two states, reason and mind act as intermediaries, which enable the being to liberate knowledge out of its imprisonment in the act and prepare it to resume its essential primacy. When the self-awareness in the mind, applied both to continent and content, to own self and other self, exalts itself into the luminous self-manifest identity, the reason also converts itself into the form of the self-luminous intuitional knowledge. This is the highest possible state of our knowledge when mind fulfills itself in the supramental. And there's a note here. Let's read Sri Aurobindo's footnote. He says, I use the word intuition for want of a better. In truth, it is a makeshift and inadequate to the connotation demanded of it. The same has to be said of the word consciousness and many others which our poverty compels us to extend illegitimately in their significance. Intuition is a word that comes from the Latin, intuere. It means to look into. So it is suggesting the direct insight into the nature of truth, penetrating into its object without reference to reason, without reference to empirical trial, without reference to analysis. So the power of intuition is a consciousness that sees its object and moves into it, and through identity with it, knows its content. This is a key paragraph which Sri Aurobindo will build upon as we go through the Life Divine. So the idea that a true knowledge arises from identity means that subject and object are linked by the knowledge. There is the knower, there is the known, and there is the knowledge. The three are one because oneness is the nature of reality. Reality may be manifold, but it is not divided against itself. It is differentiated, but there is one being. This Satchit Ananda, which Sri Aurobindo has promulgated in the stream of the Vedanta, is the final positive reality. All things are inherent in it. So all knowledge is based upon that one being. All consciousness is founded upon that. Chit contains all within itself, supports all, manifests all from within itself. So the intuition to which Sri Aurobindo refers must be a power nascent to the consciousness of Brahman. It must be implied in it. Intuition must be, in a sense, a direct action of Brahmic consciousness, because it knows by identity. Where mind has to reach and doesn't know, intuition knows simply by looking into a thing. And here, interestingly, he says, let's go back over this sentence again. When the self-awareness in the mind, applied both to continent and content, to own self and other self, exalts itself into the luminous self-manifest identity. In other words, when it rises out of division and regains that identity, which is the nature of true consciousness, it has just left the realm of reason, the realm of mind. It has exalted itself. It has gone above. It is supra-rational now. The reason also converts itself into the form of the self-luminous intuitional knowledge. So there is this transition from mind or reason into the power of intuition, which borders, and then, as he says, this is the highest, converts itself into the form of the self-luminous intuitional knowledge. So it doesn't have to reach for light, it contains it within. Just as Brahman is self-revealed, the Atman, the pure self, stands on itself, stands on no other. It shines by its own light. So too, intuition shines by its own light because it is the nature of Atman to regard itself, of Brahman to see itself in the play of self. So this, he says, is the highest possible state of our knowledge when mind fulfills itself in the supramental. So he's suggesting to us then that it is through the power of this intuition growing in us and displacing our reliance upon the mind that we gain access to what is supramental. So he'll draw this out more in coming paragraphs, but the intuition is a step upwards towards that identity of consciousness, which leads back into the supramental knowledge. So, by implication then, intuition would be the next evolutive state for an aspiring humanity. If you can't jump all the way from the rational mind into the supermind because it's too big a leap, then perhaps you can learn to live based upon intuition and then evolve from that into supermind. Such is the scheme of the human understanding upon which the conclusions of the most ancient Vedanta were built. So he's referring here to the Upanishads, to the older Upanishads. Intuitive knowledge stands at their core, in other words. To develop the results arrived at on this foundation by the ancient sages is not my object, but it is necessary to pass briefly in review of some of their principal conclusions, so far as they affect the problem of the divine life, with which alone we are at present concerned. For it is in those ideas that we shall find the best previous foundation of that which we seek now to rebuild, and although, as with all knowledge, old expression has to be replaced to a certain extent by new expression suited to a later mentality, and old light has to merge itself into new light as dawn succeeds dawn, yet it is with the old treasure as our initial capital, or so much of it as we can recover, that we shall most advantageously proceed to accumulate the largest gains in our new commerce with the ever-changeless and ever-changing infinite. A wonderful expression. So we take this intuitional basis as we find it in the Upanishads as foundational, and we build upon it, and we'll find the language necessary to use in modern times because it suits us, but we recognize the authenticity of that ancient Vedantic formulation. And here it comes. Sad Brahman, existence, pure, indefinable, infinite, absolute, is the last concept at which Vedantic analysis arrives in its view of the universe, the fundamental reality which Vedantic experience discovers behind all the movement and formation which constitute the apparent reality. Sad Brahman. Sad means real. It means true because it is real. Because it's real and true, it is pure. So Brahman would be the pure existent. So he's summarizing what is the foundation plank of the whole edifice that he's building. It is obvious, he writes, that when we posit this conception, we go entirely beyond what our ordinary consciousness, our normal experience, contains or warrants. The senses and sense mind know nothing whatever about any pure or absolute existence. All that our sense experience tells us of is form and movement. Forms exist, but with an existence that is not pure, rather always mixed, combined, aggregated, relative. When we go within ourselves, we may get rid of precise form, but we cannot get rid of movement, of change. Motion of matter and space, motion of change in time seem to be the condition of existence. We may say, indeed, if we like, that this is existence, and that the idea of existence in itself corresponds to no discoverable reality. So, our whole experience of the universe is of something moving, something temporal, something always changing. We have no sense of anything eternal beyond. That is not the nature of our experience. We have, in a sense, to posit that. If we were going to base our view of the universe and what its ultimate sense is on the construction of the senses, of what our immediate experience is, then we'd say, no, everything is relative, everything is in motion, everything is conditioned. There is no absolute. At the most, to continue, in the phenomenon of self-awareness, or behind it, we get sometimes a glimpse of something immovable and immutable, something that we vaguely perceive or imagine that we are, beyond all life and death, beyond all change and formation and action. So this is important in the midst of all of our experience, and not relying upon the mind to draw us a picture or to imagine or to project an image of what might be beyond this moving world. We get a sense of something in our own experience. Something breathes itself to us, and we have a glimpse of a greater reality. And as he writes then, here is the one door in us that sometimes swings open upon the splendor of the truth beyond, and, before it shuts again, allows a ray to touch us. A luminous intimation which, if we have the strength and firmness, we may hold to in our faith and make a starting point for another play of consciousness than that of the sense mind, for the play of intuition. For if we examine carefully, we shall find that intuition is our first teacher. Intuition always stands veiled behind our mental operations. Intuition brings to man those brilliant messages from the unknown which are the beginning of his higher knowledge. So it is the play of intuition which offers us that glimpse of a greater reality, that we can suddenly become aware of it, means that that power of intuition is at play in us, that there is something in us which is cognate with it, that it has a right to open a door in us when we are ready for it, and that as that door swings open, we see what we may become. We see from where we came. And intuition is the source of that beckoning beyond. Reason, he writes, only comes in afterwards, to see what profit it can have of the shining harvest. Intuition gives us that idea of something behind and beyond all that we know and seem to be, which pursues man always in contradiction of his lower reason and all his normal experience, and impels him to formulate that formless perception in the more positive ideas of God, immortality, heaven, and the rest by which we strive to express it to the mind. So these are figurings as the mind explains it to itself, what it glimpses in the transcendent, through the awakening of intuition, which suddenly stuns and blinds the mind, dwarfs its possibilities. For intuition is as strong as nature herself, from whose very soul it has sprung, and cares nothing for the contradictions of reason or the denials of experience. It knows what is because itself it is of that, and has come from that, and will not yield it to the judgment of what merely becomes and appears. In other words, if this is not part of the appearance, if this is not part of the becoming, this is a ray from the eternal. This is immortality coming into time. What the intuition tells us of is not so much existence as the existent, for it proceeds from that one point of light in us which gives it its advantage, that sometimes opened door in our own self-awareness. This is interesting. Not so much existence a blank, featureless existence, an homogenized ocean of milk, but an existent, a conscious being. Implied here is that this is a personality. An existent is a kind of being, an entity, a conscious, real entity. He's described it as Satchidananda, so it must also be an entity full of bliss. Ancient Vedanta seized this message of the intuition and formulated it in the three great declarations of the Upanishads. I am He, thou art that, O Shveta-ketu. All this is the Brahman. This self is the Brahman. Now, for those who like to follow these citations and know where they come from, the first, I am He, Soham. We met that in the Isha Upanishad. It's the 16th verse. Thou art that, O Shveta-ketu. Thou art that. Tattvam asi. That's from the Chandogya Upanishad, the 6th chapter, or the 6th section, the 8th chapter, the 7th verse. And one might also note that is the beginning of what is called the Chandilya Vidya, a beautiful section in the Chandogya. And also the same citation is in the Shatapatha Brahmana 10.6.3. And the last one, all this is the Brahman. Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. This is Chandogya Upanishad also, the 3rd chapter, 14th.1. And these are some of the great Mahavakyas, the great utterances, the great phrases from the Upanishad. In fact, these can serve and have served as mantras over the years. I am He. Don't let it go to your head, but and that you are, O Shveta-ketu. And all this is the Brahman. If you realize these things, if you meditate upon these things, and this becomes real to you, because these words, remember, have the power of evocation. They are mighty magnets which draw that reality to you. These are more than mere mental imaginations, but they are the power of a divine imagination. So that when you image this to yourself, more and more it becomes real to you. That which you see will become you. To continue, but intuition, by the very nature of its action in man, working as it does from behind the veil, active principally in his more unenlightened, less articulate parts, served in front of the veil in the narrow light which is our waking conscience, only by instruments that are unable fully to assimilate its messages, intuition is unable to give us the truth in that ordered and articulated form which our nature demands. Before it could effect any such completeness of direct knowledge in us, it would have to organize itself in our surface being and take possession there of the leading part. And so here again, this is a hint that attaining intuition would prepare us for the supramental, that this might be the next enabling step in the evolutionary advance. So until it is here, and operative in us, regularized, that sort of direct knowledge, which is the goal of yoga, can't be had. So we have to rise to the height of intuition. Otherwise, the mind, constantly trying to compartmentalize and gobble it up and apportion it in ways that it can understand, will diminish its value. This is one of the things that we must yogically be able to do. That is to say, when we're receiving powerful intuitions from above, we have to be able to silence the mind, so that the mind doesn't see and seize upon it and say, oh, I know what this might be. This would work like this, and this belongs over here, etc., etc. Not allowing the intuition to work in its own native capacity and work with yogic plenitude in that part of the being towards which it was aimed. The mind thinks it should be boss. I remember our friend M.P. Pundit wrote some powerful passages to this effect as well in some of his works. I refer you to them. But in our surface being, Sri Aurobindo writes, it is not the intuition, it is the reason which is organized and helps us to order our perceptions, thoughts, and actions. Therefore, the age of intuitive knowledge, represented by the early Vedantic thinking of the Upanishads, had to give place to the age of rational knowledge. Inspired scripture made room for metaphysical philosophy, even as afterwards metaphysical philosophy had to give place to experimental science. So there's the range from inspiration down to philosophy, down to science. Intuitive thought, which is a messenger from the superconscient, and therefore our highest faculty, was supplanted by the pure reason, which is only a sort of deputy and belongs to the middle heights of our being. Pure reason, in its turn, was supplanted for a time by the mixed action of the reason which lives on our planes and lower elevations, and does not, in its view, exceed the horizon of the experience that the physical mind and senses, or such age as we can invent for them, can bring to us. And this process, which seems to be a descent, is really a circle of progress. That's wonderful. I was going to make a bad joke. To back up, when he was talking about intuitive thought being our highest faculty, and how we diminish from the metaphysical down to pure reason, for example. Just as, for those of you who work in, or have worked in universities, just as the faculty has had to devolve power to the administration, just so the real power of light dwindles down into mere machinery. So that was for Madden.
True.
So back to Sri Aurobindo's point here, which is that even if this seems to be a diminishing of the power of consciousness, yet it leads to a circle of progress. For in each case, he writes, the lower faculty is compelled to take up as much as it can assimilate of what the higher had already given, and to attempt to reestablish it by its own methods. By the attempt, it is itself enlarged in its scope and arrives eventually at a more supple and more ample self-accommodation to the higher faculties. Without this succession and attempt at separate assimilation, we should be obliged to remain under the exclusive domination of a part of our nature, while the rest remained either depressed and unduly subjected, or separate in its field, and therefore poor in its development. In other words, this is going to lead us, this succession leads us to a right balance and a real integration, because the mechanical mind, the physical mind, the rational mind get exposed to the power and the light of intuition and can learn through practice to receive and assimilate it. It can become open to those higher ranges and no longer offer only difficulty of acceptance, but real accommodation and real partnership. With this succession and separate attempt, the balance is righted. A more complete harmony of our parts of knowledge is prepared. We see this succession in the Upanishads and the subsequent Indian philosophies. The sages of the Veda and Vedanta relied entirely upon intuition and spiritual experience. It is by an error that scholars sometimes speak of great debates or discussions in the Upanishad. Wherever there is the appearance of a controversy, it is not by discussion, by dialectics, or the use of logical reasoning that it proceeds, but by a comparison of intuitions and experiences in which the less luminous gives place to the more luminous, the narrower, faultier, or less essential to the more comprehensive, more perfect, more essential. The question asked by one sage of another is, "What dost thou know?" Not, "What dost thou think?" Nor, "To what conclusion has thy reasoning arrived?" Nowhere in the Upanishads do we find any trace of logical reasoning urged in support of the truths of Vedanta. Intuition, the sages seem to have held, must be corrected by a more perfect intuition. Logical reasoning cannot be its judge. And just so, when you look into the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, for instance, and you see the dialogues, the challenges between and among Yajnavalkya and the other sages who gather at the court of King Janaka, then you find that it is always the larger which displaces the lesser. It is the greater knowledge that wins the day and takes home the cows, which are themselves symbols of plenitude, of light. And yet the human reason demands its own method of satisfaction. Therefore, when the age of rationalistic speculation began, Indian philosophers, respectful of the heritage of the past, adopted a double attitude towards the truth they sought. They recognized in the Shruti the earlier results of intuition, or as they preferred to call it, of inspired revelation, an authority superior to reason. But at the same time, they started from reason and tested the results it gave them, holding only those conclusions to be valid which were supported by the supreme authority. You can write here Shankara and his formulation of Advaita Vedanta based upon the teachings of his guru, preceptor, Gaudapada. To continue, in this way, they avoided to a certain extent the besetting sin of metaphysics, the tendency to battle in the clouds because it deals with words as if they were imperative facts instead of symbols, which have always to be carefully scrutinized and brought back constantly to the sense of that which they represent. And this is the fault. Their speculations tended at first to keep near at the center to the highest and profoundest experience, and proceeded with the united consent of the two great authorities, reason and intuition. Nevertheless, the natural trend of reason to assert its own supremacy triumphed in effect over the theory of its subordination. So even though this great enunciation of philosophy based upon Vedantic insight began with the idea that it would stay close to the spiritual experience. So that was primary, that this great intuitional body of knowledge formulated in the Upanishads was indeed the basis. This was the foundation on which we will build and defend our philosophy. Still, they were led step by step by reason towards a point where the experience became distant and the reason predominated. Logic began to displace spiritual experience and realization. Hence, the rise of conflicting schools, each of which founded itself in theory on the Veda and used its texts as a weapon against the others. So in theory, it was Vedic, but it was warfare. So, knowledge fought the wisdom of the heart fought the actuation of knowledge in life. And really, heart and action and knowledge ought to be synthesized, should be unified and part of the experience of oneness. Knowledge is not the enemy of love. Power is not the enemy of knowledge. For the highest intuitive knowledge sees things in the whole, in the large, and details only as sides of the indivisible whole. Its tendency is towards immediate synthesis and the unity of knowledge. So this is intuition. Reason, on the contrary, proceeds by analysis and division and assembles its facts to form a whole. But in the assemblage so formed, there are opposites, anomalies, logical incompatibilities, and the natural tendency of reason is to affirm some and to negate others which conflict with its chosen conclusions so that it may form a flawlessly logical system. So we cut part of it out. We can't abide it. No, that imperfect world where there's dust on the floor can't belong to the immaculate nature of Brahman. That must be whole, undivided, undiminished by this which moves, this which decays, this which is reborn. The unity of the first intuitional knowledge was thus broken up, and the ingenuity of the logicians was always able to discover devices, methods of interpretation, standards of varying value by which inconvenient texts of the scripture could be practically annulled, and an entire freedom acquired for their metaphysical speculation. So, knowledge unites. Reason divides. And we come now to the last paragraph and an invitation to the next chapter. Nevertheless, the main conceptions of the earlier Vedanta remained in parts in the various philosophical systems, and efforts were made from time to time to recombine them into some image of the old Catholicity and unity of intuitional thought. And behind the thought of all, variously presented, survived as the fundamental conception, Purusha, Atman, or Sad Brahman, the pure existent of the Upanishads. Often rationalized into an idea or psychological state, but still carrying something of its old burden of inexpressible reality. What may be the relation of the movement of becoming, which is what we call the world, to this absolute unity? And how the ego, whether generated by the movement or cause of the movement, can return to that true self, divinity, or reality declared by the Vedanta. These were the questions, speculative and practical, which have always occupied the thought of India. So, world and self. are figurings of that Sad Brahman, that pure existence. Can we realize it? And the name, the title of the next chapter is The Pure Existence. And Sri Aurobindo then launches us on a journey which embarks upon the coverage of all the worlds, all the planes of being, as he does in his great epic poem, Savitri, when, as Ashwapati, he does the same thing. So I think we have finished with this chapter this evening. Do you have a question? Good then. Shall we go?
I have exactly a question, but we're talking here, it seems, about intuition almost in the abstract, but in fact, intuitions get translated through an instrumentality which oftentimes is faulty. And so by the time it gets translated into something as a movement or a philosophy, it's an imperfect translation of the original intuition.
Mm-hmm. That's what we said, correct?
Right, which isn't necessarily related to reason as much as it is the impurity or the lack of capacity of the instrument.
Mm-hmm. That's true. He's writing about intuition relationship to reason because he's arriving at the methods of knowledge. How can we know what is true? We began the chapter with the inadequacy of the senses. The senses can't get us anything, even if we don't rely upon the senses but use the mind, manas, as that which goes out and gathers data about the world and self. What it brings us back is still a poor figuring. It is not the thing in itself. And it is not reason that can reach to that either, but a power of intuition. A power of intuition that, because it's native to the Brahmic consciousness, is always present and can bring to the reason a light which opens it to the experience of the aha, there is something behind. And that will be the experience of intuition in the mind, in reason, pure. In the life powers, of course, it gives it the readiness to act correctly, to know what to do. You might say that it's instinctive, but it is intuition acting through the machinery of the lower life powers as expressed and manifested in the flesh. Now, what intuition does in its own characteristic realm is another question. There it simply knows. It doesn't have to work through these intermediaries. But since Sri Aurobindo is here trying to establish what it is that will give us a sure knowledge of this Sad Brahman, he is saying that intuition is that power to offer that self-identity, that revelation of truth. So.
I have a little quick question. Didn't I hear you in the reading say that as we pass into a more intuition-based acquisition of this knowledge, the reason then falls into place, subjugated behind it to assist, or it also eliminates itself into a more assistive sort of process rather than domination?
I wish it were as accommodative as that. It can be done.
It seems like he said that in one of the sentences, though.
I think that it can be done, and that is what yoga will achieve in us as we grow to establish the power of intuition as being dominant in life. This circle of progress that he described shows that even though we seem to devolve, that we've left the age of the Upanishads, and here we are now, in a sense, demanding that the senses give us a veridical picture of the world. That will allow us to turn that circle up again, right? Because it's an encircling. And so the power of the reason will be able to accept the light of intuition. Presumably the powers of science, if they extend far enough based on their true pursuit of what is valid knowledge, would permit intuition into its ken, K-E-N, and thus we would arrive at the unification of consciousness to the mind. The mind would become aware of belts of awareness beyond itself. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. You would, if you had a belt, really a belt, it's got all these different holes in it, right? And the point where it's penetrating is one thing. So if you put it somewhere else, it's different. So too, if you had different wavelengths of a radio band, you can turn to one station or another station, etc. But take an image of a mountain, the higher you go on the mountain, the farther your vision. These are all analogical, but what it means is that if intuition is permitted to act in its own native right, is welcomed and not fought against, then we would be able to amass a kind of human knowledge which would permit us to consciously evolve to the next step. It would be a more harmonious advance. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The circle of progress, it seems to say that science will eventually discover the more powerful role intuition plays.
Yes.
Eventually discover that it'll keep digging and find its own tail more or less, like, oh, there I am.
Right. And the invitations have been sent. So.
Another question.
Okay.
What he has described is the process of devolution, or falling down from intuition and spiritual visions of the Vedantic seers to then metaphysics, and then practical reason and experimental science. Mm-hmm. So this downward movement, now how does that coincide with the Sri Aurobindo philosophy that we are on an evolutionary path from matter to life, to mind, to higher mind, and then supermind? I thought we are on upward curve now in the history of mankind.
I see your point, but his point is that it is absolutely necessary for our power of knowledge to, in a sense, drift to what seems to be the base of things in order to complete the circle, to be able to reverse it and carry it back up. At no point in India's history, for instance, have we lost the intuitional knowledge that the sages have accumulated in themselves. Sage after sage has taken birth, or soul after soul has become enlightened, always finding this same truth behind, which is unutterable and inexpressible, but able to see reflected in the pages of the Vedanta that this is real. But so too, even with that realization, we can look at the labors of metaphysical philosophy and see where there is light and where there is darkness in it. We can look at the play of science and see where it is validating a part of what is sensorial existence, but missing the much that is left to discovery. We have lost nothing of the spiritual knowledge along the way, but we are incorporating more and more of the world. We are extending the field of knowledge. It may look, in the way that this has been expressed, that the curve is downwards and it's hopeless. I think it's absolutely the other way, that we can be full of hope because we are trying to penetrate into the very core of obscure nature. And if we continue to drill through, we'll find, isn't this the point, that we can't get far enough with our instruments. It is only with our consciousness that we can get there to answer that. And that means that we have to rely on supraconscious powers of awareness. Supraconscious, that's not what I mean. I mean supra-rational powers of awareness. We have to go back to the intuition and what lies above that. Sri Aurobindo is not giving that part of the story away yet. And I'm not going to cheat either.
Could it also be true that some of our greatest scientists, we call them scientists, had the knowledge revealed to them intuitionally? I'm thinking like Einstein, and then they spent lifetime justifying rationally what they kind of perceived it.
It's popular to say that Einstein was really a mystic who had, and as he said himself, he had a cosmic religious experience of the universe. But it is not quite the same thing as what the sage of the Upanishads has realized. But is there a play of intuition in them? Yes, absolutely. There's a play of intuition in the mathematician who suddenly sees how a greater order of mathematics can come into being. You know, Leibniz is a great example of that, who is also a great philosopher. At the same time, Newton discovered calculus, maybe in the same moment that Leibniz did. And he was a physical scientist, but also a theorist. So, and what was his name? Ramanathan, who was the mathematician from South India?
Ranganathan.
Yeah, who had this...
Ramanujan, I think.
Ramanujan?
Ramanujan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who had, a consistent experience that whenever he went to sleep at night, he would, with a mathematical puzzle in his head, he would wake up in the morning with a solution to it. Because he prayed, I think, to Saraswati, the goddess of inspiration, who then revealed it to him in sleep. So he woke up with the answer. And in the Veda, of course, Saraswati is the power of inspiration, just as Ila is the goddess of revelation. They're powers of the divine consciousness of intuition, as we call it in English. To look into. Think about that. To look into means it's as if you're looking into yourself. What am I feeling now? I'm looking at myself. I'm feeling joy. I'm feeling hunger, whatever it might be. You know yourself, huh? So the power of intuition looks and knows by identity. It's not looking into another. It's not guesswork. It is sure. And to, again, hit the refrain, the mind, of course, receives the intuition and then hacks it to pieces. Could this be true? Can I trust this? Well, let me think again. See if it comes back the same way. We ruin the intuition by not being receptive and not being transparent. Yogically, the exercise is to quiet the mind as well as you can, receive the intuition, and act upon it in full faith and trust. And the more you give yourself to it, the more the intuition will come to you. You'll be, in a sense, widening the hole in yourself, the aperture through which the light can come. By being receptive, by being open, greater and greater floods of light can come into you and find an active poise, and then guide your life surely. But if instead of being receptive to it, you doubt it, you say, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe, I'm going to go back and get my book out again and reread the chapter, and you're not going to trust the insight. Then, instead of the aperture widening, the aperture begins to close. This is a simple yogic truth, and it's something that you can apply to your life tonight. So now to meditation. Namaste.